Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's The Election and Your Finances, be hosted by myself and the fabulous Becky O'Connor from PensionBee. And we're going to be talking all about the recent elections and how this will affect your finances and investments as well. So this will be recorded, and our Propel Pro members can access this afterwards if you ever wish to. And we do usually circulate some sort of recording as well. If you've got any questions whilst we're going through, please feel free to ask away. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So don't worry if we're not answering straight away. We'll come on to them at the end. But I know sometimes whilst it's fresh in your mind, it is easier to ask away. We've got Sabrin saying currently on index funds, which is a fabulous start. If anybody else wants to let me know where they're joining from this evening and also what stage of their investing they're at, that would be fantastic. I'll just give it one more minute or so. We've got somebody from Hampshire, which is fabulous, and really excited to learn new financial landscape. It's certainly changing a little bit, though we're still in those early days of the new government, as we can say now, but we'll get on to talk about that, how it's going to affect, as I say, your finances and your investments. So I will kick off with what we're here for this evening. So this will be 60 minutes to leave you hopefully with actionable and tangible steps that you can take away to maximize your finances, investments and pensions. If anybody missed that at the beginning, there will be a section for Q&A at the end. So do feel free to ask away in the chat whilst we're going through, but we'll come on to them at the end, whether it's either for myself or for Becky when I hand over to her. And just as a brief disclaimer to get the important bits out the way at the beginning as well, any content presented in this webinar is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as financial advice nor an invitation to invest. And as with all investments, your capital is at risk, but do remember that any investments that we speak about, any past performance is no indication of future performance. So I think I kicked this off at the beginning as we had a few technical issues there, but if you do want to share a bit more about yourself in the chat and where you're joining from, I think we've got somebody else from Hertfordshire as well, somebody too from London, from Spain. This is awesome. And Isabel from Birmingham as well. So it's great to have you all here. I don't know if you can see all that as well, Becky, whilst I'm having a look.
I can see it. Yeah, it's great to see so many investors.
It really is, isn't it? Great to see so many people joining us from all different places as well. So this evening, we're going to be going through a brief intro of what we're talking about before going into an overview of the results, what this means for money and taxes. Becky's then going to pick up what this means for pensions and investments, and then we're going to go into what you can do today before a brief Q&A. So there's a brief mention on Propel. Some of you might be totally new here. Some of you might be familiar to who we are. Propel was founded by Aisha Offrey as she had worked as a wealth manager and realised that actually the people that she was helping weren't those that she really wanted to be helping the most. She saw that as women, there's not much out there that feels like it tailors or caters for us. And as a result, she set up Propel. And with this, hopefully, we can access and provide a wealth of knowledge with our free courses, blogs, and guides. And keep your eye on your emails now that you've joined tonight, because coming to your app stores soon will hopefully be the investing as well. And as I say that, I do just have to note, if you do invest, your capital is at risk, but the email will come through to you and let you know all about the exciting opportunities we have and how you can access them in due course. So we're joined by myself and Becky. I can do a little intro on you unless you want to run through it yourself, Becky, tonight.
I'd much rather you did it.
Absolutely. I can absolutely take that. I hate doing the intro on yourself. It's really difficult, isn't it? But it's really a pleasure for us to have you here. Becky is the Director, VP of Public Affairs at PensionBee, which you may be familiar with if you've ever considered combining your pensions. She's also the Telegraph's pension doctor, as well as a columnist for the iPaper, and has her own blog and has been an author of the ESG Investing Handbook, thinking all things sustainability. So I would suggest that you check that out if you're ever wanting to look at more ethical investments. So Becky's going to talk to us just shortly about pensions. I'm going to head up first what the upcoming elections mean specifically for your money. As a brief introduction to myself, I'm now heading up content here at Propel, but in a former life, I was also, similar to the founder of Propel, a financial advisor. I'm UK and US qualified and have helped hopefully thousands of women kickstart their investing journey and learn more about how they can take charge of their wealth as well. So a brief overview of the results then and what the recent elections meant and what actually some of it looks like. We've got some lovely graphics drafted up by our team, which shows this, a Labour win, as most of us now know. Labour won the majority of seats in Parliament. There was an increase of 209 seats since the last election in 2019. There's also been still some seats allocated to various other parties, including 121 to Conservatives. Lib Dem got 72 seats, and there was 46 other seats, which were across various different parties, including the SNP, Sinn Féin, Reform and Greens. So a really nice visual for you there as to quite how big the Labour majority is. It doesn't show it in real shape, but it at least gives you some idea as a breakdown of the figures. It wasn't a huge surprise. A lot of the polls in the run-up were suggesting that this was going to happen. And as a result, a lot of the impact on the likes of the markets and your investments, many have seen that actually it's relatively minimal because this particular outcome wasn't a huge surprise. And especially when we compare it to what we've had in terms of political turbulence over the last few years, the outcome was more or less predicted from a lot of those pre-polls, and there was nothing therefore to take markets by surprise. It was also seen as a bit of a win for women. And when we look at the current elected parliament, there's the highest ever number of state-educated women in cabinet. There's also a record number of ethnic minority seats, with 89 in total. And Rachel Reeves is the first female chancellor in over 800 years. We've also got Louise High as the youngest woman to serve as a cabinet minister. So a real step towards equality, many are saying. Of course, there's still more that can be done, but it certainly feels like we're moving in the direction that we here at Propel, and I'm sure many of you joining this evening would also want to see. So what does a Labour win mean then? Because their manifestos focus on these 5 points. The first was economic stability. The next is NHS waiting times. Third being border security. Fourth being antisocial behaviour. And the fifth being all around recruiting teachers. Now, these are just 5 points that they included in their manifesto. Of course, we've seen loads more, and since the King's speech last week, we've seen even more bills that they've announced they're going to include and be focusing on. But this is a lot of what their election campaign really honed in on when they were talking about why they wanted to be elected and what they wanted to focus on. So what does economic stability mean? Because really that's the one that shouts out as the one that does affect our money and our investments the most. Essentially, what they've said so far is that they're going to be focusing on tough spending rules to keep taxes, inflation, and mortgages as low as possible. It still remains to be seen what all of that means in detail. We've still got a lot to wait on in terms of what they can release, what they're going to plan, and what they're going to say. But we have a bit of a feel for what that might start to mean. And that's what we're going to be talking about just shortly when we mention what the new election means for your money, your investments, and your pensions. So what does this mean then for money and for taxes? So as a brief overview, what they've given us a flavour of are various different areas. And to be honest, none of them are particularly dramatic for the moment. In many ways, for our investments, this is a relatively good thing because it means that things are calm. There's not any huge curveballs, or so it seems, quite yet. And as I said, if you've got existing investments and you've seen that they've been relatively stable, tickety-boo, this may well explain why. But as an overview for what they've said they're going to be focusing on, the first is actually frozen income tax bans. These were done by the previous government and they're frozen up to the year of 2027, 2028, as the tax year crosses over to calendar years, if you like. Those frozen income tax bans doesn't necessarily mean anything, but the one key thing to note is that it might mean more people get dragged into paying higher tax. It's something called fiscal drag, which you'll see in the bubble just below. Essentially, they're not going to change the tax rates. It's not like they're making them higher or lower. But as we see inflation go up, people can end up paying more tax because they fall into a higher tax bracket. There's not necessarily anything you can do about this other than to keep your eye on using various tax efficient methods, including the likes of pensions, ISAs, and any other systems that you may have spoken to advisors or read about before. They've also said that they're not going to make any, at the moment, changes to corporation tax. So for any business owners out there, this seems relatively stable too. There are potential changes to inheritance tax. This is a funny little tax which sometimes we neglect to think about for relatively obvious reasons. It can be a little bit morbid. Amongst some of the changes that they've sort of mentioned have been reports, but not confirmed, things, very, very small details, such as business relief and lifetime gifts. But nothing confirmed, all in draft and all very much reported. So one to watch and potentially be aware of, but nothing to necessarily action right now. They've also mooted the idea of changing some things to private equity. So if you've got private equity funds, for example, then you may well see certain changes, but again, mooted and not something that necessarily requires direct action. They decided to continue the tax on non-doms, or at least the tax changes that had come into play. You may or may not remember that these were relatively controversial back at the time that Rishi Sunak, head of the Conservative Party, was in charge, as his wife fell into this category. In reality, it's a relatively small category of people that do fall into this, and you'll likely be aware if you are. What this means is they're just carrying on with it, and you'll likely be aware of those changes anyway if it does affect you. There's some changes to do with offshore trusts that if you do fall into that category, you may want to look into with a relevant specialist, qualified individual who can help out, because it is relatively complex what they're thinking of doing, and it may well affect your overall tax status. And last but not least, they're talking about extending the minimum wage. And this means that essentially they're looking at reducing the age minimum for minimum wages, which hopefully means that if there are any youngsters joining us tonight and you're looking at that kind of a job level, it may well mean that you're in a slightly stronger position. But all very mooted for the moment. I'm going to hand over to Becky now, who's going to be talking about what this means for your pensions and investments.
Hi everyone. Zoe, I hope you're happy to just flick through the slides.
Absolutely.
So pensions were mentioned in the first minute of the King's speech at the opening of Parliament last week. So we know there are going to be changes to the pension landscape. What we don't know is to what extent those changes are going to affect any of us individually. Some of the changes may affect retired people. I actually suspect that many of them will be more likely to affect younger people at the beginning of their careers going forward, based on what Labour wants to do. So the ones that we have already been told about, the state pension triple lock, they are going to keep that in place. That's a guarantee that the state pension will rise either in line with earnings, inflation, or by 2.5% every year. Interestingly, this year, if Keir Starmer does actually go ahead with a public sector pay rise of 5.5%, it is likely that people who receive the state pension will be getting again a fairly bumper increase in the state pension from next April. That would be probably in line with the wage rise, which would be around 5.5%. So that's a vote winner in terms of retired people, because they very much depend on the state pension for the bulk of their retirement income in most cases, and as will many of us, in fact, because it does tend to make up a large proportion of your annual income when you retire, from the age that you become eligible for it, which is obviously changing. The lifetime allowance was abolished by the previous government. That was a cap on the amount that you were able to invest or have in your pension without facing a tax charge. It was just over £1 million before, and it has been abolished. Now, Labour had said that they would reintroduce the lifetime allowance. It didn't go down very well as an idea with, well, it has to be said, anyone really, even those who would not necessarily be affected by it. I think there was a general view that it's quite nice and simple to not have a lifetime allowance at all. But the previous government did keep the 25% tax-free lump sum, which is, you know, the maximum you can put in is just over £250,000. So it was roughly a quarter of the previous lifetime allowance. That still remains in place. So that's something that the current government may look to change. They may make it less generous on the basis that few people, you know, have that amount of 25% tax-free lump sum to take anyway. They may leave it alone, but it's very unlikely that they would abolish it or increase it in line with inflation. And the other thing that we can hopefully look forward to is a simplification of the pension landscape, because pensions are horribly complicated. Nobody likes them. Nobody likes to think about them. And one of the reasons is that it can be very complicated, and it becomes increasingly complicated as you move through working life and you approach retirement and you're faced with a bunch of options on how you take your income. Anyway, there are various measures on the table for simplification of the pension landscape, which I will talk about shortly. So the state pension. What pension are you going to get when you eventually retire? Well, the state pension you can only get when you reach the state pension entitlement age, which is currently 66. It's rising to 67 in 2028. There are further tabled rises to age 68. They are not coming in anytime soon. It may rise even further. There's been talk of the state pension age rising to 70. This is in order to keep the state pension sustainable for the government to continue to offer it to everybody. It is a benefit, by the way. It's not a right. So they could take it away at a moment's notice. So not that I wish to make us all feel grateful for having any state pensions to look forward to, but it's just to bear in mind that, you know, it's there for the taking for them in terms of policy change. If you want to know how much state pension you've already accrued, you can look at the government gateway, and if you just put into Google, you know, how many qualifying years national insurance, it will take you to the page. You put in your national insurance details, and you should be able to find how many years of national insurance contributions you've already made. You need to make 35 over the course of your working life in order to get the full state pension when you retire, or when you reach state pension entitlement age. It's not necessarily the same time. And you need to have made sufficient national insurance contributions for 10 years to get any state pension. And between 10 and 35 years, it's a sliding scale up to the maximum. So you can check. You can get national insurance credits for missed years if you were taking time out of work for, you know, for instance, for looking after children. And there are ways to do that, but there are limits on the time frame. You can go back up to 6 years, generally speaking, to get the national insurance credits for missed years. But that's something worth looking into if you haven't got a full NI record. Generally speaking, and this is completely anecdotal, when people look at this qualifying years for themselves, it's often a nice surprise, and you find you've made more qualifying years than you think you have, perhaps because you did enough hours when you were working at university, or part-time, you didn't even know you were making national insurance contributions. So you may be further ahead than you think. It's worth checking. And then in terms of private pensions, now you have a workplace pension if you're employed, and through auto enrolment, anybody who is over age 22 and is earning over a certain amount, it will have pension contributions from their employer going in automatically. This was a great move, and it just means that now you don't have to opt into a workplace pension. So hopefully you have gathered some workplace pensions from previous work, and you're currently paying into one. Obviously, if you're self-employed, it's a bit different. If you want to know how much you have from all your private pensions together, you have to look up all those details from previous schemes. Previous annual statements will give you the most recent balance of your pension. You can add all of that up. You have to do all this yourself, by the way, at the moment, because there's no pensions dashboard, which is this amazing thing that's going to show us all in one place what all of our pensions add up to, which hasn't been launched yet, and stalls and stalls and stalls, but one day might happen, maybe with this government. But until then, you have to do it yourself. You look up the annual statements and you add it all together. It's worth checking whether you have maximised your employer matched contributions, because although all employers are obliged to make sure that you're paying an 8% in total, with a minimum of 3% of that contribution coming from the employer, many do offer more generous schemes. So although the minimum is 3%, you might be able to go up to 5% or even 7% from the employer. And sometimes if you're really lucky, they double match those contributions. So if you put in 7%, your employer will put in 7%. And that's an incredible bonus. They don't necessarily shout about it, so it's worth checking, because if you can afford to make that extra contribution, the extra that you get through a double match employer scheme is incredible. So I did actually just talk about the triple lock. So Labour have confirmed that they will maintain the triple lock. In terms of what this means for the economy, it's a huge commitment to spending, because obviously the older population is growing all the time. It's really important, obviously, to make sure that everybody has a decent standard of living, and that's what the state pension is there to do for those who have built up enough national insurance credits. For those that haven't built up enough through working life, there's something called pension credit as well, which if you're eligible for that, it typically falls just below the amount of the full state pension, and that's for low-income pensioners. So there is a safety net there if for any reason you don't manage to accrue enough qualifying years to get state pension. So the state pension increases in line with inflation, average wage growth, or 2.5%. That does tend to mean that it increases by more than other benefits, which have made it quite controversial in the past, because working people haven't seen the same growth in their benefits, such as universal credit, as pensioners. Nevertheless, the lock is there to make sure that living standards for older people who don't have the option of working again is maintained. So, as did the Conservatives, Labour have said they will keep it in place. There is a bit of an issue at the moment around the increases in the triple lock and the state pension, leading to some pensioners potentially being in a position where they might end up paying tax on their state pension, because the rises will have pushed people over the personal income tax threshold of £12,570. We're not there yet, but it is a real risk. I never thought I would say that. It seems completely perverse that people would end up paying tax on a benefit, but hopefully that issue will be redressed and they'll increase the personal tax threshold before that happens. So currently the full new state pension is worth £11,502 a year. I don't know what that sounds like to you, but if I tell you that does make up the majority of most pensioners' incomes, that gives you an idea of what older people are living on. So the lifetime allowance, this was just over £1 million. It has gone. Good riddance to those of us in the pensions industry, because it made life incredibly complicated. People would build up a huge pension, and then they were like, oh no, do I want to keep going with this? Because that cap used to also include investment growth, which was obviously a disincentive to invest well. So most people agree that it's good that it has gone, and if it was reintroduced by Labour, it wouldn't be a great move. They have gone very quiet on that, so I don't think it's going to happen. I think they'll look at other things instead. And who needs a lifetime allowance when you have an annual allowance, which is £60,000 or up to your taxable earnings in a year. There is also something called carry forward. So if you ever get to the wonderful point where you are close to the annual limit for your pension contributions, but you didn't make full pension contributions up to the annual allowance for you in the previous 3 tax years, you can use something called carry forward and backfill those previous years. it's something to think about if you come into an inheritance, or you get a bonus, or you get some redundancy payout or something like that. It does start to become relevant, because pensions are obviously, you know, a great thing to invest in, because of the tax relief. So we have an annual allowance, but no lifetime limit for now. So now we get to what are Labour actually going to do. They in the pensions bill, they have talked about a number of new measures. Most of it is actually to do with changing the way pension funds invest on our behalf, to increase the amount that default pension funds, which is the ones that most of us get plonked into when we join a new workplace scheme, to increase the proportion that is invested in UK growth businesses. So at the moment, a typical pension is mostly weighted towards the US. It's mostly weighted towards tech stocks. So you will have Amazon, Meta, Google, Nvidia, all the big tech names within the top 10 holdings if you're in a workplace default pension fund. Now, the new UK government, and in fact the Conservatives before, through the Mansion House reforms, were thinking, hang on a minute, we want some of that for the UK, because we don't have enough money to invest in all the infrastructure we need, all the green infrastructure, and we've got all these great UK businesses that can't get off the ground because there isn't enough money floating around in the UK. I know, let's look at people's pension funds, and whether we can divert some of that money into the UK. So actually that is going to be a major theme going forward for the Labour government. So it's worth, if you're interested in this and what your pension is currently invested in and what it might be invested in, do keep a lookout for these news stories flowing through, because it sounds very remote, and like they're talking about institutional funds, and they're asking all the big life insurance companies to put 5% of a pension fund into the UK, but it's actually your money and it could affect your retirement as well. And Rachel Reeves has said that the average pension saver should benefit by £11,000. I'm not quite sure where that figure has come from, but you know, it's there. It's a commitment of sorts. So it's something to hold them to account for, I think. We will hopefully see a reduction in lost pensions through various measures. Now, the previous government talked about introducing a pot for life, which would enable you to choose your own pension provider and bring across previous workplace schemes as you leave them into your provider pension pot of choice. There has also been a new idea, which is, it's not called magnetic pensions yet, but this term is floating around, where your pension from a previous workplace scheme automatically comes with you to a new one. And then it would depend on the size of the pension. There is talk of it, you know, only being for smaller pensions, so that you don't lose track of those smaller pensions, because they can add up to a huge amount over time. And unfortunately, with such job churn now, particularly in your 20s and 30s, it's very common for people to forget about old pensions, particularly if they don't think they're very valuable anyway, if they're like £1,000 or something when you're 24. Never mind, you know, you think you can move on. Actually, over time, in 40 years' time, that could have grown quite a lot. So Labour are looking at ways to make automatic the movement of pensions with you through your working life, so that you don't lose track of them. What do you think is most complex? All of it, probably.
Yeah, that's a question for
In
me.
theory, these things simplify things for people, and mean that you have to think about your pension less. But I think in practice, there's still going to be a fair amount of, you know, you having to do things for yourself for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that UK economic growth point, though, which sounds relatively positive.
Yeah, I mean, we need it, don't we? And I think everybody is feeling a little bit more positive about their personal finances. Certainly our data suggests that people are feeling more positive since the general election results, and a new government, and fresh thinking about how we do everything. So in terms of what it means for pensions, do expect that your pension money will be used to fund some of the projects and companies that will support UK growth. Now, that does sound brilliant and like a win-win for everybody, but I would caution that, like in the past, we've had initiatives like public-private finance initiatives, and often the result is that the main profit is made by the middlemen who are making all the deals and charging 8% for the the introducing the pension fund to the opportunities and so on. So that's just something to bear in mind. Maintain a skeptical eye on this plan. It could, in an ideal world, generate massive returns, because of course, if you invest with some risk over the long term, generally speaking, if that business is successful or that infrastructure project is successful, so too should your investment, which would include your pension. So we want to believe that diverting more pension fund money to the UK economy will result in better investment returns for our pensions. But in the past, these initiatives haven't always worked. There is another idea that's been suggested, which is the Great British ISA. Now, this was suggested by the Conservative government. The idea behind it was that people would then have the choice, if they want to invest in boosting the UK economic growth, then they can use the Great British ISA. If they don't want to, they don't have to. They can stick with a variety of other funds. I quite like this idea because it did introduce choice. So if you think that those infrastructure projects or tech businesses that are UK based represent good investments, then you could make that decision for yourself. Now, the ISA industry didn't seem too keen on it. They couldn't quite see how it would work in practice, how you would get enough, frankly, to generate a whole ISA full of investable assets for people. So there's more work to be done there probably before it's introduced. Okay, so the King's speech we had last week, and I will actually add to this because we've had more announcements, or not announcements, but speculation in the last couple of days on what could happen to pensions. So we do know that the plan is to enable everybody to move their small pots automatically. This should mean fewer lost pots, getting better returns, hopefully, although it does depend on the fund. And again, hopefully delivering value for money, because not all pension schemes are good value. It's not just about the fee, it's also about the obviously the investment returns. So you may have a reasonably low fee, but the performance has been pretty dire. What we need, and something that the FCA is looking at, is a much more universally applicable way of assessing for people whether they're getting good value for money from their pension, because over time, if you're not, that can be really detrimental for your overall retirement pot size. And there is also a new requirement now, or not, it hasn't been introduced yet, but it's been proposed as part of these new measures, that all pension schemes should also offer a retirement income option for people. At the moment, many workplace schemes allow you to build up the pension as you go through working life, then you hit retirement age, and then they kick you out because they don't all offer the full gamut of retirement income options for everybody. And if they don't offer the right one for you, you then have to go through the very complex process of finding a new provider and also choosing which is the right sort of plan for you, which can be very daunting when you actually come to the point when you want to retire and start to take an income.
And then last but not least, Becky, and the Great British ISA, which I know you've touched upon, but I'm sure lots of people are curious just to hear that a little bit more about.
Yeah, so the idea is that it gives you a bit of extra ISA allowance. That might tempt you, actually, if you've already filled up your ISA allowance, just to go that bit further. And it's just UK focused. We don't know what businesses would be in it, what funds would be in it, whether or not they represent good investments. I would say if they were British growth investments, they would be at the riskier end of the risk scale. But if you are intending to invest in that for a long time period, then you could be rewarded handsomely. It is a potential win-win scenario. if you're prepared to take the risk in some quite early stage businesses that haven't received a huge amount of funding yet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for running through that. So what can you do then today before we move into some Q&As? And as I said at the beginning, either for myself or Becky, through what we've gone through. So I think first and foremost, it's all about reassessing your budget. There's never really a bad time to do this. And it sometimes sounds a bit basic, but with a half-year point and a bit more clarity on what is going on with the likes of money and taxes, and frankly, very few changes, it's just worth checking in on your spending and budget to make sure that it's still in line with kind of where you want it to be. The next thing that you can do then is just check in on your investments. Again, none of those changes are particularly dramatic, and it might feel like we've spoken through quite a few there, which are all worth knowing, but none of them are kind of roaring in with something absolutely huge. But you can still check in on what your investments are doing, where the markets are at, and also have a look into potential opportunities. Some are pinpointing the likes of housing, aerospace, renewable and oil as various different areas that the new government might be focusing on. And those who are looking for more short-term opportunities might want to seek investments in them. Of course, if you're going to do this, it's worth checking it out, making sure that it's right for you, and really doing some due diligence, because they really are potentially short-term and more speculative opportunities, if you like. There's no telling quite what they're going to do with all these areas, but it's certainly an interesting one to look into if you're seeking out slightly different investments and to diversify your portfolio as well. And last but not least, with your pensions, because we've spoken quite a bit about pensions and they are super important, it's always worth taking a moment to check in, whether you've taken some nuggets away from what Becky said there about either combining your pensions, thinking about the investments in them, knowing what they're actually invested into, and having a look at your state pension contributions as well as your private ones as they are. It's always worth having a quick look. So the 3 steps that you can take away from today, hopefully, into your finances, your money, and your investments to see what you can do next. Now, let's happily move into a Q&A section. I'm going to have to stop sharing for this Q&A, but do feel free to sign up to our next event whilst we're on this as well, which will be all about sustainable money choices. If you scan the QR code on the screen now, that should take you to the sign up page. I'm going to stop sharing so I can come on to see all your lovely faces and to see if there are any questions as well. So do feel free to ask away. As I said, if there's anything that's popped up this evening, either for myself or for Becky, whether it be on some of those changes that we've seen from the government, whether it be on your pension or investments or anything that you just piqued your interest, please do feel free to ask away. I know sometimes people feel like sometimes there's silly questions in their mind, but honestly, there is no such thing as a silly question in my book. Oh, we've got a question, Becky, that's come in, which is all about thinking if you're 19 years old, so very much at the beginning of your working career, and thinking about putting away a certain amount, around 500 in savings every month. How would you handle it? Like the money to grow larger by the time we're 22. So we'd appreciate some thoughts. I'll let you kick off, Becky, if you want, and I can pick up as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, from the pensions point of view, you can access the money from age 55, although that is rising to 57 from 2028. So it would not be 55 for you. It would be at least 57, probably 58, before you could access money in your pension. I would say, obviously, as a huge advocate for pensions, the money you put in early in working life really adds up because of compound interest. So over the years, that they could be the most valuable contributions that you can make to your pension, ironically at the time you least feel like making pension contributions. It's if you're 19, you won't be automatically enrolled yet. We do expect that the government's going to bring that minimum age down for automatic enrolment down to 18 relatively soon, but you're 19 now, so if you want to look at doing it now, you'd have to opt in for yourself. If you're a basic rate taxpayer, you get tax relief on your pension contributions of 20%. High rate taxpayers get 40%. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that there has been talk of Labour potentially introducing a flat rate of 30% tax relief for all taxpayers, regardless of the income tax rate that they pay, which is very interesting and would be a huge further boost for basic rate taxpayers in terms of what's actually going into their pension and what it costs them. So it basically means that a pension contribution of £100 that you make would cost you £70 instead of £80. So it's a much better deal if you're in that position. So there's something to benefit from there as well. And that's the kind of uplift that you just don't get from savings. Now, you know, with pensions, when you take the income at the other end, it is taxable, which is different to ISAs. So if you wanted that money sooner than the minimum pension age, then ISAs might be worth looking at instead. And if you're 19, I guess you don't really know if you would want it sooner, but a great position to be in. And actually, sometimes you can have more disposable income at the beginning of your career, even though you've got lower income, generally speaking, because you have fewer outgoings too. So it's a great opportunity to build up a little pot if you can. So well done.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's super helpful. And as you touched upon there, ISAs as well. Of course, everybody has £20,000 a year of ISA allowance. So you might want to think about some of those priorities, whether you use a combination of different ISAs, because there are different types out there, cash, stocks and shares. The lifetime ISA as well, and some of them might help to align sort of what you want to achieve with that money, and where you want it to go in the best way for you as well. Got a really good question come in as well, Becky, about what have we heard about likely IHT impacts that the new government is planning. Do you want to kick off with that one?
Well, I have mainly been interested in the pension side of things and inheritance tax and pensions. So at the moment, you generally don't pay inheritance, or your beneficiaries do not pay inheritance tax on any money left in your pension. It's not for all pensions, but most of them now that applies. So that's an incredible benefit of pensions as a way to save, because whatever is left in them that you don't use goes tax-free to your beneficiaries. I suspect that is something that Labour will look at changing, because it is considered a generous benefit of pensions that typically only wealthier pension savers tend to benefit from, because obviously, you know, many people use their pension for their own income, not to leave to beneficiaries. So that's something that may go. And yeah, in fact, I would even put money on that. Generally speaking, inheritance tax changes are deeply unpopular, even though they don't, you know, few people realistically end up facing it on estates, because mostly the wealth will be in residential property, and because of the way inheritance tax works on residential property, there's often an effective threshold of £1 million for what is passed down. And so, you know, if you know your family property is worth less than that, typically you won't end up paying any inheritance tax. Nevertheless, it is considered a real steal. It's a steal tax that the government makes, even if it doesn't really affect people. So I would expect that they would look at other measures to increase tax revenue and personal taxation before altering those thresholds, particularly the residential ones.
Yeah, definitely. And I know they've given some little tidbits away as well about potentially changing business tax relief, agricultural tax relief within inheritance tax, which are kind of exceptions in there. They affect a very, very small percentage of the population, as well as potentially changing the gifting rule, which is a little bit more commonly known, to do with the 7 years as to how long it is that you can give a gift and it not be taxed. But they're all reports, rumours at the moment. Whether it goes ahead, we don't quite know. All kind of remains to be seen, and a little bit more about watch this space, I think. So that's the roundup for IHT. Nothing very concrete at the moment. We've got quite a few coming in now about specifically pensions, Becky. So I'm just going to fire a few at you. I hope that's all right. Sabrina has kicked off with where can we check where our private pensions are actually invested into, firstly?
So your pension provider should have on their website at least the top 10 holdings and the description of the funds that your pension is invested in, and it should be updated quarterly. I say should because I know it can be quite difficult to find that sort of information on providers' websites. So, I mean, do have a look. Some are better than others. Nest is pretty good. Aviva is pretty good. So Scottish Widows, so Legal in General. I don't know about all the others, but if you can't find the information that you're looking for, do just email them and say, I really want to know where my pension's invested, and what the risk profile of that pension fund is, because especially if you're younger, you can, generally speaking, afford to take a bit more risk with your pension fund, and the default fund isn't always as risky as it could be if you're looking for higher growth in the early years. So again, you'd be looking at, you know, the companies and also the risk profile, and you know where the money is invested globally as well. If you've got more than one pension and you do this for a couple of pensions, you would find that they're very, very similar, regardless of the provider. Those top 10s look very similar. So yeah, it should all be on the website, but email them if not.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question as well come in about SIPs and whether it's a good idea to set up a SIP on top of your workplace pension as well.
If you have got the money and it's all within your annual allowance, because that annual allowance covers all of your different pension arrangements. It's not 60,000 per pension, it's 60,000 for all your pensions. So if you like more control over your investments, if you have, you know, particular investments that you want to make and you feel a pension would be the right place to make them because they're particularly long term, and you know, from the tax relief point of view, you would actually like that benefit as well, then yes, because SIPs give you a much wider choice. With a workplace pension, you have usually just a choice of risk profiles. With a SIP, you have a choice of all the funds and trusts and stocks and shares on that particular platform. So I mean, the more pensions the better, and I do have a SIP as well, and I quite enjoy having the ability to change my pension investments for myself. I think if you feel quite confident doing that, then it can be worthwhile.
Gives you something to play around with for sure. I think quite similar to that, somebody else has asked, how do you sort of manage a pension if you are self-employed, got somebody on an IR35 contract, so you're just contracting at the moment? How does that work really, I guess?
With IR35, I confess I don't really know the ins and outs of how that complicates your personal pension provision, because I think it depends on things like whether you're with an umbrella company and whether or not they provide a pension. I don't know, I'm sorry. In terms of having your own personal pension as a self-employed person, yes, absolutely. We offer personal pensions at PensionBee. Others do too, and you just open it for yourself and set up your own contributions, and you do get the tax relief. But with personal pensions, it is worth bearing in mind that they are relief at source schemes, which it's a terminology, but it basically means that if you're a higher rate taxpayer, you will get the basic rate tax relief added automatically by your personal pension provider, but you will have to claim the rest of your tax relief yourself through your tax return. So just worth bearing in mind, because a lot of people don't do that and miss out big time as a result.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something to watch out for if there is anybody that's, of course, I think with each and every individual tax situation, it's worth seeking tax advice if you're ever in doubt. But with that IR35 situation, speak to your employer or whoever it may be that's contracting you, see if they can help and go from there and make sure that you're claiming back the relevant taxes if you're able to, because there can be lots and lots of reliefs there. And we've got a few then just regarding some of those combinations. Firstly, how do you track them down? Is that something that, for example, PensionBee help with? And is there any sort of charge for bringing them together? How does that work?
So there is no charge for bringing them together. There is a charge for the pension plans, just as there are with any pension plans, with PensionBee, on an annual basis, which is a percentage fee. It depends on the plan that you choose. PensionBee doesn't trace the old pensions for you. We need the details of the old pensions. You need to know where they are. So you need to know either the name of the provider or your old employer. And through those details, we can then do the legwork of bringing them into one place for you. but we need some key details first. So unfortunately, there's no way around not, the importance of not forgetting the details either of the old employer or the old pension provider, or keeping hold of the old paperwork. Sometimes previous employers change names, and that can complicate things. And it's another reason as well to actually, whenever you move house, make sure that your old pension providers have your new address details. It's another bit of admin for when you move, but it's one really is one company that you really want to have each of your new address details every time you move. And helpfully, I've just seen somebody's put in the chat, there is a government pension tracing service which is free and well worth using. If you Google it, there are others that pop up which may charge. You don't need to use them because there's a free government one.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that was Marcia. So thank you so much for that assistance. And I think we've pretty much reached the end of the questions there. So thanks so much. There was quite a lot of quick fire ones there for you, Becky, on pensions, but clearly it's as I'm sure you're very well aware, it ignites a conversation because people don't necessarily think about it, and they are really, really complex. So it's always
that lid.
exactly. It's always great to have an expert on hand. And thank you again for joining and putting up with the slight tech issues that we had there at the beginning. As I said to everybody, do make sure you keep an eye out on your emails for exciting updates coming from Propel shortly. And have a lovely evening, ladies. Thanks so much.